Okay, so philosophy of language is about lots of things, but perhaps the core topic in philosophy of language is meaning. For example, we've seen Frege and Russell discuss meaning. Frege, of course, divides meaning into two elements, sense and reference, whereas Russell wants to get rid of the sense and just try to explain meaning in terms of reference, if he can. Both of those are engaged with what you might call sentence meaning. That is, if you were to ask what is it that has meaning, what is it the meaning of which you are trying to explain, it would be sentences. It would be bits of language that say things. Now that seems kind of obvious. But what we're going to look at now is a different approach to meaning. This is exemplified by a classic article just called Meaning by this guy, H.P. Grice. Everybody called him Paul Grice. That's his second, the P in H.P. Where he lays out an attempt to explain speaker's meaning. Well, specifically, he has a two-stage project. The first is to explain what speaker's meaning is. How it is that utterers or speakers of sounds or... now, actually, this kind of meaning is purposefully broad. So sentence meaning, the only thing that a sentence meaning project can explain the meaning of is a sentence, because sentence meaning is in terms of analyzing the language units that make up sentences. So, for example, Frege Russell's project helps us not at all with nonverbal meaning. It couldn't possibly explain why it is that, certain gestures or movements of the face or anything mean something. And yet, clearly, we do have a concept of meaning that applies to those. Grice wants to tackle that. He wants to tackle the kind of meaning that can cover anything that a human being can do, like waving their arms, drawing a picture is one of his examples, those kind of things. So if you were to put it crudely, you would say if you're engaged in a project examining sentence meaning or explaining sentence meaning primarily, what is it that has meaning or produces meaning in some sense is units of language. Whereas with Grice, what is it that produces meaning is people. People are the meaning producers. And this is what he's talking about when he's kind of, right at the beginning of the article, he distinguishes between what he calls natural meaning and non-natural meaning. So natural meaning he just talks about and then discards because he says, I'm not going to talk about that. And the example of that is those clouds mean rain. And we do use the word mean. So in some sense, the clouds are a sign of rain. But that's a different kind of thing from what he calls non-natural meaning, which is essentially what humans do. So he talks about natural meaning, but just to discard that and say, I'm not going to deal with that. So, for example, natural meaning can't be deceptive. That is, we don't say the clouds meant rain, but then it didn't rain. If the clouds mean rain, then it's got to rain. The clouds can't, fake you out. Why? Because, and the reason why, the reason for most of these differences is because humans, or this could include aliens or, Coco the gorilla who can do sign language. So it's not just humans, but, are intentional beings. That is, they can have intentions, whereas nature doesn't have intentions, which is why in natural meaning there isn't being that is doing the meaning. It's just clouds mean rain. They just do. But nobody means rain by the use of the clouds. There's nobody behind it. I guess if you're religious and you believe that God is pulling the strings, then you would say basically collapse natural meaning into non-natural meaning. But this really is the kind of meaning that he's going to talk about it, and it's in terms of speaker's meaning. Now, I'm going to come back to the Frege-Russell project of starting with sentence meaning and talk a little bit about these distinctions, because these distinctions are made by people who are sort of in this camp. So Grice's two-stage project is to first explain this in terms of intentions. So he's going to say, okay, we all understand speaker's meaning. To illustrate the distinction between sentence meaning and speaker's meaning, let me give you a couple of quotes from the works of Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland, Alice Through the Looking Glass. Lewis Carroll's real name was Charles Dodson, and he was actually a Cambridge mathematician, so he probably would have been familiar with the kind of logic that Frege did. But so there's a lot of kind of logic jokes and things that are found their way into Alice in Wonderland and Alice Through the Looking Glass. Here's a quote from Alice in Wonderland. Alice has said something, and then this is at the Mad Hatter's tea party. "Do you mean that you think you can find out the answer to it?" said the March Hare. "Exactly so," said Alice. "In other words, that's what I meant." "Then you should say what you mean," the March Hare went on. "I do," Alice hastily replied. "At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know." "Not the same thing a bit," said the Hatter. "You might just as well say that I see what I eat is the same as I eat what I see." "You might just as well say," added the March Hare, "that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like." So what is the difference between I mean what I say and I say what I mean? Well, the speaker's meaning is that you are doing the meaning, and what you say acquires the meaning that you intend to give it. And that is perhaps clearer in the second quote I'm going to give you from Alice Through the Looking Glass, which is Humpty Dumpty talking. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in rather a scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." "The question is," said Humpty Dumpty, "which is to be master, that's all." So, can you, the speaker, make words mean what you want them to mean? Are you the one in charge? Well, the speaker's meaning seems to suggest so, because the two-stage project that Grice is engaged in is to start by explaining how it is that a speaker can mean something by what they say, and then to explain sentence meaning, the meaning of language, in terms of speaker's meaning. So Grice's project is reductive. It's going to say, I'm going to explain sentence meaning in terms of speaker's meaning, which is in terms of intention. So then you're reducing the meaning of sentences to the meaning, to what humans do. Now, we've already looked at Donnellan, who talks about two uses of definite descriptions. And that distinction also seems to parallel the distinction between sentence meaning and speaker's meaning. Because if you remember, the attributive use of a definite description like Smith's murderer, it picks out whomever is Smith's murderer. That sounds like the reference is achieved by the meaning of the words. Whereas he says there's another use of definite descriptions where you can refer to someone who isn't Smith's murderer, but because you believe him to be, and everybody understands that you believe him to be, you successfully pick out that person, even though the words are not true of it. So in that sense, the reference is achieved by you, by your intentions. That sounds much more like speaker's meaning. So here we have a kind of, in that example about definite descriptions, we have the two camps being illustrated. Now, Frege and Russell are perhaps the most famous supporters of this, although there are plenty of contemporary philosophers too. Grice did the most work to explain speaker's meaning. The American philosopher Searle took on the project and added some features to it. P.F. Strawson is also in this camp that says that meaning is something that humans do. They do it with words. Humans do the meaning with words. It's not the words that are doing the meaning. Whereas here, it's the words that are meaningful, sort of in virtue of what they can do. Now, one of the reasons why one might be in this camp is that it seems like language has a structure. And one of the key insights of the Frege-Russell project is that the meaning of sentences is dependent on the smaller units that make up the sentences. That just seems obviously true. So in some sense, meaning is achieved by constructing out of smaller units. And it's just true about any natural language that there is literally an infinity of possible sentences that could be meaningful. Yeah, I'll come back to that. All right. So let's look at Grice's attempt to explain meaning in terms of intentions. Okay, so he says an utterance, X, is meant subscript NN, which just means non-natural meaning. Basically, if we hadn't brought up natural meaning, we could just say meant. But he wants to establish, I'm talking about non-natural meaning. This doesn't apply to natural meaning. But natural meaning is kind of I don't want to say unnatural use of the word meaning, but it's kind of a minor use of it. So most people kind of do away with this subscription when talking about it. They just talk about meaning. So what is it to mean that X, which is an utterance, like something said or written or indicated by gestures, that has meaning? How? To say that it meant, that it had meaning would be true. So yeah, notice that I can make non-meaningful utterances, right? I can just grunt or, think of Tourette's. Some Tourette's sufferers, I believe this is pretty rare, but famously some Tourette's sufferers blurt out phrases randomly and often obscene phrases, which is rather embarrassing. But they don't mean anything. They're just a sort of reflex response. So the Tourette's sufferer does not mean anything by that utterance. If anything, it's not something that they do, it's something that happens to them. So it's possible to make utterances that don't mean anything. Okay, what distinguishes the utterances that you make that do mean something from these ones that don't? Okay, to say that an utterance has meaning would be true if that utterance is intended by its utterer to induce a belief in some audience. So think of the Tourette sufferer. When they're just producing sounds involuntarily, they have no intention. They don't intend them to have any effect on an audience. So notice that this element picks out what you might say that this camp sees as a vital feature of meaning. It's a mechanism for communication. So that's why we've got an audience here. So meaning is something that happens communally, that one person has to mean something by having even if it's like an imaginary audience, or maybe themselves as an audience. There has to be an audience, and the utterance is intended by the person who utters it to induce a belief in some audience. And furthermore, to specify what the belief is to specify what the meaning is. So if I sort of gesture like I'm at dinner, my mouth's full, and I think I want some salt, and I sort of gesture at the salt and sort of catch the eye of someone and sort of make a gesture implying, give that to me. What does that thing I just did? It has meaning. And in virtue of what does it have meaning? Well, the gesture was intended by me to produce a belief in the person I'm making it to, and the meaning is the intended belief. And the meaning is, pass me the salt, or I would like the salt, or something like that. Now, Grice immediately recognizes that this is not in itself good enough. And he gives this example, starting on the bottom of page 381 in the original pagination of the article. I might leave B's handkerchief near the scene of a murder in order to induce the detective to believe that B was the murderer. So in other words, you're trying to set up this person called B, and to do so, you leave his monogrammed handkerchief at the scene of the crime. So you have an audience, the detective that will find it, and you intend them to acquire the belief, oh, B is the murderer from seeing this, and the belief, and this implies that the belief, B is the murderer, is the meaning of the handkerchief. And what Grice says is, well, that's not true, is it? The B's handkerchief being there doesn't have meaning. So if my account says that it has meaning, then there's something wrong. But we should not want to say that the handkerchief or my leaving it there meant anything, or that I had meant by leaving it that B was the murderer. So he says, I've got to fix, the first two are not enough, because the first two imply that B's handkerchief means something, and it doesn't. So I've got to fix this. So he adds this extra condition, which is where Grice's accounts, we're just looking at the first one. He tinkers with this account across decades, and it becomes so intricate. It's like, you knew that I knew that you knew that I knew that you knew that I knew, and it's like, oh my God, it's very hard to keep track of. But try for this early version. So the thing to fix the first two so that they no longer imply that B's handkerchief means B is the murderer is to add this extra condition. The utterer of X has a further intention that the audience recognize the original intention. Now, why does adding this avoid the problem of B's handkerchief? Because B's handkerchief, when I drop B's handkerchief, I expressly do not want the inspector to know that I dropped it there intending him. Because if the inspector knows that I did it with the intention of making him think that B did it, then my deception won't work. So, but if we add that, then it looks like, so not only do I have to intend by my utterance that you acquire a belief, and actually he later changes it, belief, it doesn't have to be belief. It could be get you to do something. Because one of the things, the advantages of the speaker's meaning approach is that, well, the sentence meaning approach tends to be combined with, certainly in Frege and Russell and Quine and later philosophers, with an attempt to explain meaning in terms of truth. Okay, so in the Frege-Russell account of sentence meaning, meaning is truth conditions. That is, two sentences mean the same, like snow is white and Schnee ist weiß, mean the same because they have the same truth conditions. Every time it's true to say Schnee ist weiß, it's true to say snow is white. Every time it's false to say Schnee ist weiß, it's false to say snow is white. So they have the same truth conditions. That is how they explain meaning. But the trouble is, the downside to this approach is there do seem to be significant chunks of language that don't have a truth value. And classic examples of this are questions and commands. So for example, if I say, what's the time? That doesn't have a truth value. What's the time, true or false? It doesn't make sense. And yet, my question, what's the time, is clearly meaningful. So that is a problem for this project. Whereas speaker's meaning, as becomes clear in Grice and Searle's articles, can account for these meaningful questions and commands, provided you change the effect on the audience to more general. So obviously, when I intend to adduce a belief, it's to do with me trying to convince you that something is true. So like that B is the murderer. But if I want you to pass the salt, it wouldn't necessarily be a belief, but it would be an effect in my audience. It would be to get them to give me the salt. But the broad account of speaker's meaning could be adapted to handle things that the sentence meaning account seems to struggle with. These parts of language like questions and commands that don't seem to be connected with truth. Now, have we got a perfect version? Well, even Grice already says, no, there's still a problem with this. And he gives the example, the biblical example, of John the Baptist and the Herod presents Salome with the head of John the Baptist on a plate. Clearly, this act of presenting Salome with the head of John the Baptist on a plate fits this definition of meaning. There's no deception involved in this. Herod wants Salome to believe that it was him that cut the head off and all that. So he means something by it. I can't remember what the exact meaning of it. I think Salome is asked by somebody else to demand John the Baptist, and I can't remember who. But Herod supplies it, and in supplying it, it's meant to indicate, see, I did what you said, and because you said you'd do something for me if I did this for you, well, now you have to do that something for me. So there's a lot of meaning behind it. Well, he doesn't want it to say that that has the meaning of the belief that it's intended to induce. Even though, unlike the case of B's handkerchief, it does have this further intention that the audience recognize the original intention. Salome recognizes that this act of Herod's of giving her the head is supposed to make her believe something. So the final change in this original article that Grice makes is that the belief or response is caused by the recognition. So this is supposed to, this extra addition is supposed to be what makes the difference between examples of non-meaning and similar examples of meaning. So the classic distinction here, that the classic illustration of the distinction that Grice gives is on page 382, just like John the Baptist's head. He says, I show Mr. X a photograph of Mr. Y displaying undue familiarity with Mrs. X. So it's as if, you're a private detective who's been hired to find out if, hired by a husband to find out if his wife is having an affair, and yes, you provide the evidence. Well, there's two possible ways of providing the evidence. You show a photo, or you draw a picture. I don't know what kind of artist you are. But he says the second one, the drawing the picture, is a meaningful utterance, or it's something that you do that has meaning, whereas the first one isn't. Why? Because the first one could achieve its effect without satisfying D. He says, if you just saw the photo lying about, you would acquire the belief, oh, my wife is being unfaithful because there's the evidence. Whereas with the drawing, that wouldn't be true. If you just saw the drawing, you would, because you know it's been drawn by someone, you wouldn't know what it was meant unless this is satisfied, which only happens when it's in the right context and you can tell, oh, this person is drawing me this picture in order to convey this. So it's only when you're in circumstances where the belief, my wife's having an affair, is caused by the recognition that this picture is intended by the private detective drawing it to induce the belief that my wife is having an affair. Huh. I told you it got complicated. But wait, there's more. This is the extent of Grice's original account of what it is for an utterance, which can include an action like drawing a picture or making faces or speaking. So it's nice and broad. It covers much more than sentence meaning seems capable of doing. And it explains it in terms of the intentions of the people who do that. Why? Because non-natural meaning seems to require people who are capable, beings who are capable of intentions to mean something, because that's the only way that you can get deception, or that you can talk about what was meant by an utterance. There has to be someone capable of doing the meaning. All right, so that's Grice's project, and it sounds like a promising project. Now, there's a guy called Ziff who wrote a response article in the 60s, 67 or something, to Grice's article, and he comes up with the example of an irritable academic called George, who is being asked to take a sanity test that George, being irritable, feels is beneath him. And here's how it goes. On being inducted into the army, George is compelled to take a test designed to establish sanity. George is known to be an irritable academic. The test he is being given would be appropriate for morons. One of the questions asked is, what would you say if you were asked to identify yourself? George replied to the officer asking the question by uttering, That's basically what it says. Well, you read it. Now, what's the point of this example? Well, what Ziff wants to say is this utterance of whatever meets all of the criteria to be meaningful. So if it is meaningful, then it means something. And what it means is the belief that the audience, in this case the army officer, acquires on hearing it. And as he puts it in the reading that I gave you, George intends the officer to be offended, and moreover, he intends to induce the officer's being offended by means of the officer's recognition. Yeah, so the officer gets pissed off because he sees that George intends to piss him off by saying this thing. Now, that seems to mean that the utterance, the series of grunts, has meaning, because these are the criteria that if you satisfy it, means that what you uttered had meaning. But the very point of the exercise, says Ziff, is that the statement doesn't mean anything. And that's part of why it's insulting, why it's offensive, because it doesn't mean anything. So that seems to be a very nice kind of reductio of this position. At this point, John Searle comes in and thinks that he's got a patch, if you will, for the Gricean explanation of speaker's meaning. And he adds this extra condition, that the utterer's intentions, this intention and this intention, the intention to induce some effect or belief in the audience, and the intention that the audience recognize the original intention, those intentions are illocutionary, not perlocutionary. All right, so we need to explain that terminology. Now, Searle himself did not invent this terminology. It's invented by a guy called J.L. Austin, who was a colleague of Grice's at Oxford, and who actually probably influenced Grice on this process, because he's very much in the camp that meaning is something that humans do with their words. It's not something that the words do by themselves. He wrote a book, in fact, called How to Do Things with Words. And he invented this idea of a speech act, which is something that you do with your language. So meaning is something that humans do, which is very much this kind of idea. So Austin, very influential on Grice. And Austin, who's a part of a movement that was called the ordinary language philosophy movement, which said that what philosophy should do is look incredibly closely at what we do, very fine distinctions in meaning and what we do with language. So it's when philosophy was at its most pedantic, and it's always pretty pedantic. He made this distinction between illocutionary and perlocutionary speech acts, things that you can do. Now, the difference is this. An illocutionary act is something that you could fill this blank with. I hereby blank. Whereas a perlocutionary, you couldn't. Okay, why? Well, look at the comparative lists. Examples of illocutionary acts are report, announce, predict, request. You can say, I hereby report. So what does that mean? If it's an illocutionary act, that means that you doing it, by doing it, accomplishes it. So what does it take to report something? Just reporting it, just saying something. So you can, by your act, you can say, I hereby report, and you're doing it. You're done. The report has happened. You have successfully reported. Contrast that with perlocutionary. In perlocutionary, it's not enough for you to do something. The audience has to also do something. And that's not in your control. So that's why you can't, with perlocutionary action, say, I hereby frighten you. No, I don't frighten you. I can say something intending it to cause you to be frightened, but I don't frighten you unless you do something. It's it's in your control to a certain extent. Now, of course, with frighten, it's a thin line. If there are certain things that are involuntary, then you might argue that if you know someone is super fearful and will jump at anything, does that count as illocution? No, because it's still, they have to contribute something. It's not merely that all there is to it is you doing something. In perlocutionary, it's you doing something plus an effect happening. So if the effect doesn't happen, which is always possible, then you haven't achieved it. So you can fail to do perlocutionary acts, but you can't fail to do illocutionary. I can request something, but I can't persuade, frighten, amuse, or inspire you without some effect happening to you. Whereas I can predict something just by saying it. I can announce something just by saying it. So that deals with the irritable academic because the effect there, the intention, was perlocutionary. It was to get the person asking the moronic questions about, as a sanity test. It was to annoy them. So the effect in the Zipf's example was perlocutionary. If you restrict it to illocutionary, things that don't require an effect to happen, then you don't get Zipf's counterexample. Now, Searle himself suggested that just adding E is not going to be enough by itself. And he gives an example to illustrate this. And this is the example that involves the German phrase, "Kennst du das Land, wo die Zitronen blühen?" which, sorry for my German pronunciation, which means, do you know the country where the lemon trees bloom? That's the sentence meaning of that phrase. Now, I'm just going to read out the section from Searle's article. Suppose that I'm an American soldier in World War II and that I am captured by Italian troops. I remember the Italians and the Germans were part of the Axis, so they're both enemies, but they're allies to each other. And suppose also that I wish to get these troops to believe that I am a German officer. So obviously he can't get them to believe that he's an Italian officer because he doesn't speak Italian and they do. But he can get them to believe that he's German and they're on the same side as German. So if he does that, they'll have to release him in order to get them to release me. What I would like to do is to tell them in German or Italian that I am a German officer. But let us suppose that I don't know enough German or Italian to do that. So I attempt to put on a show of telling them that I am a German officer by reciting those few bits of German that I know, trusting that they don't know enough German to see through my plan. Let us suppose I know only one line of German, which I remember from a poem I had to memorize in a high school German course. Therefore, I, a captured American, address my Italian captors with the following sentence. Kennst du das Land, wo die Zitronen blühen? All right, what's the point of this? Well, the point is that according to A through E, his utterance of Kennst du das Land, wo die Zitronen blühen, which remember is German for do you know the country where the lemon trees bloom, has meaning, and what it means is I am a German officer. Why? Because it's intended by its utterer to induce the belief in the Italians that he is a German officer, and therefore it means that belief. And this is an illocutionary intention. Well, actually, this isn't really an illocutionary intention, but yeah, this is still perlocutionary. But there's still even, this illustrates a further problem that makes it different from Zipf's case. Because Zipf's case was a meaningless statement, okay? So the problem in his case was that blah, 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 or whatever it was, this said that it meant something, and it doesn't mean anything. Whereas the problem here is that this says that Kennst du das Land, wo die Zitronen blühen means I am a German officer, when in fact it has meaning, and that's not what it means. Okay, so we need to add an extra condition, which is that the meanings of my utterance has to be settled by conventions governing the use of X. As he puts it, in the performance of an illocutionary act, the speaker intends to produce a certain effect by means of getting the hearer to recognize his intention to produce that effect. And furthermore, if he is using words literally, he intends this recognition to be achieved in virtue of the fact that the rules for using the expressions associate the expressions with the production of that effect, which is another way of saying the words he can only mean by the words, if he's using them literally, what the conventions of the speakers of those words mean by it, which, because it's a German phrase, the conventions establish that that German phrase means do you know the country where the lemon trees bloom? Okay, now Searle thinks that we then have a pretty decent approach, a pretty decent attempt to do this first part. We've explained speaker's meaning in terms of intentions. And Searle is of the belief that speaker's meaning is primary, and if we are going to explain sentence meaning, it must be in terms of speaker's meaning. Is all of this plausible? I mean, this sounds incredibly convoluted for something that children can do. Children are able to communicate. Are they really intending and recognizing, in communicating, is a child recognizing that another child has the intention to induce in them a belief by means of the intention to induce that belief? Is that what's going on? That sounds like way too complicated. The British philosopher Simon Blackburn, who is sympathetic to this project, says, well, no, it's not too complicated. Describing it is complicated, but actually we're capable of very subtle and complex interactions. We're just designed that way. Human beings, we are capable of meaning something by the twitch of an eyelid because of the machinery that comes built into us for communicating. And he quotes an old poem by a guy called Coventry Patmore, and it's called The Kiss. And it goes like this. I saw you take his kiss, 'tis true. O modesty, 'twas strictly kept. He thought me asleep, at least I knew. He thought, I thought, he thought I slept. So read that through and think about it. I saw you take his kiss. So somebody's accusing this woman, he kissed you. And he said, it's true. And she said, well, what, basically you slut. And he said, oh, no, I kept my modesty. Why? Because he thought me asleep. At least I knew he thought, I thought, he thought I slept. Think about what's going on there. Now, so what is the appeal of this approach? Well, it seems to avoid some of the shortcomings of sentence theory. Like I said, sentence meaning, certainly the version of it that was the project that was most familiar to Grice and those guys in mid-20th century, is this idea that the meaning is cashed out in terms of truth. And then, of course, that can't deal with things like questions and commands, which don't have truth and yet are clearly meaningful. So that seems to be a problem for sentence meaning. And also, sentence meaning can't explain the meaning of gestures and, and like drawing pictures and all kinds of things that are clearly meaningful. It seems like sentence meaning then seems to be just a small corner of meaning, which is much broader, and the broader meaning should be what explains the small corner, because the small corner can't explain the rest. So that does seem to be a good motivation for saying we've got to explain this broader concept of meaning, and then once we've got a handle on that, that should be able to explain the sentence meaning. But, as people like Ziff point out, there's a fatal flaw with this approach. And that is that Searle is trying to smuggle in a notion of sentence meaning into the account of speaker's meaning, because he doesn't want it to be the case that you can say kennst du das Land wo die Zitronen blühen and mean I am a German officer. That's just not true. When you say kennst du das Land wo die Zitronen blühen, you mean, do you know the land where the country where the lemon trees bloom? So in other words, Humpty Dumpty is wrong, which is what Alice is pointing out to him. You know, you can't make words mean what they don't mean. So then words mean something irrespective of the intention of the person saying it. Uh-oh, that's a problem for this. Now, what people committed to this project say, okay, but general intentions still explain it. It's the intentions of the average speaker of this language that explains. So the intentions of the average speaker of German establish that "Kennst du das Land, wo die Zitronen blühen" means, do you know the country where the lemon trees bloom? So we're still explaining sentence meaning in terms of intentions. But there's a fatal problem with trying that, which is there are an infinite number of sentences. There are sentences that nobody has ever uttered. An author of another philosophy of language textbook suggests, my third cousin enjoys carving symbolist poetry on watermelon rinds. He said, before I wrote that, nobody had uttered that before. It hadn't been written, it hadn't been said, it hadn't been thought. But it's meaningful. So, why is that a problem for this approach? Because there aren't any established conventions about that sentence. Because nobody's ever uttered it. So, we haven't established conventions. What establishes the meaningful is the rules of grammar. Now, back to this. Frege and Russell and the sentence meaning guys draw a distinction between syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Syntax is grammar. That's the rules of putting sentences together. Whereas semantics is what explains the meanings of the sentences once they're grammatical. What's an example to illustrate the difference? Well, a famous example is colorless green ideas sleep furiously. That is grammatically perfect. For English, it's got adjectives, verbs, nouns, all in the right place. And yet it is meaningless. So syntax and meaning, you cannot explain meaning purely in terms of syntax. Grammar is not meaning, because you can have grammatical sentences that are meaningless if it's the wrong combination, if you're applying an adjective that doesn't go with the noun. So colorless and green, you can't be colorless and green, and neither of them is true of ideas. And ideas can't sleep, and you can't sleep furiously. So it's the meaning of the various components there that puts a block on that whole sentence meaning anything, because the meaning of idea reveals that you can't apply the adjective colorless or green to it, and the meaning of the verb sleep means that you can't sleep furiously. So semantics is the project of explaining meaning, and the Frege-Russell approach to semantics is truth-conditional semantics. It's explaining meaning in terms of truth. But certainly syntax is related in their project. That is, you can make new meaningful sentences provided you follow rules of syntax plus you combine the right nouns and verbs and adjectives. You can produce an infinite number of meaningful sentences that have never been uttered by anyone. And that creates a pretty much insuperable barrier for explaining the meaning of chunks of language purely in terms of what the speakers of those chunks of language intend in uttering those. Because you can come up with brand new unuttered sentences that have already got meaning despite nobody having established any conventions for their use. So what the Frege-Russell camp says, there's this other thing, pragmatics. That's a different thing, and that is where you explain non-standard uses of sentences, like what is it to be metaphorical? What is it to be sarcastic? So that's where we look at the utterers of the sentences. But meaning is independent of pragmatics. Pragmatics is just sort of something on top of meaning. Meaning, we're going to explain the literal meaning of words, and that's something we can do without talking about the utterers. when you want to say, well, what did so-and-so mean when they said this in this circumstances? Well, then you're doing pragmatics. But you can do semantics independently of that. Whereas the speaker's meaning guys say, no, semantics and pragmatics, they go together because meaning is something that people do, not something that sentences do by themselves. But the unuttered sentences is a big problem for this whole project. There you go.